Welcome back, my friends. We are on video 3, pages 14 to 17. Remember, go get your magazine if you don't already have it so that you can follow along. We have already learned a little bit about the president, about his early years as a child and young man, his early military career, which started with the French and Indian War when they were still colonies. A little bit about America throughout George Washington's full lifetime. Looked at this beautiful portrait. And then we learned about his career as a general, leading the colonists, the Americans, to victory and forming the United States of America. So this video, we're going to read about Washington as our president. So let's get started. Page 14 and 15, everybody. President Washington. When Washington became the nation's first president, he had to figure out exactly what his job was. Americans had just fought a war to rid themselves of a king. They certainly didn't want another king. But what did they want? Americans decided to have a government by the people and for the people. However, no other nation at that time had such a government. Without the powers of a king, could Washington build a strong national government and unite the 13 colonies? So this beautiful photo that spans both pages says, on April 14th, 1789, Secretary of the Congress, Charles Thomson, arrived at Mount Vernon to tell Washington that he had been elected president. Knowing it was his duty, Washington reluctantly agreed to take the job. One of the first decisions to be made was what to call the new president. Some suggested His Highness or His Excellency. Lawmakers settled on Mr. President. So even though George Washington didn't really want to be president, he agreed because it was his duty to the country. And this photo right here. After the American Revolution, Washington expected to return to Mount Vernon and lead a quiet life as a farmer. However, just a few years later, he went to Philadelphia as a delegate, or a representative, to the Constitutional Convention of 1787. He agreed to oversee the meeting. Washington's leadership gave the nation confidence in the Constitution that the delegates produced. And then he was elected president. Bottom of page 14 here. Let's look at this photo. While Washington was president, lawmakers chose a site for a permanent capital city. Southerners wanted the capital in the south, but Northerners wanted it closer to them. Finally, lawmakers agreed to a site on the Potomac River, just 12 miles from Mount Vernon. At first, it was called Federal City. Today, we know it as Washington, D.C. And over here. Washington worked hard to show the power of the new government. In 1794, there was a rebellion. Farmers in western Pennsylvania refused to pay a government tax on whiskey. The farmers shown here have tarred and feathered a tax collector. When thousands of farmers marched in protest, Washington called out 13,000 troops and led them part of the way himself. This show of strength ended the whiskey rebellion. So people were upset that they had to pay extra money for their whiskey, called a tax. So they poured tar, a really sticky substance, on a man and then put feathers on top of it because he was coming to collect the tax money. But then Washington showed up with his troops and the rebellion stopped. All right, over here onto page 15. After 4 years as president, Washington wanted to go home to Mount Vernon, but he agreed to serve another 4 years. During Washington's second term, war broke out between France and England. Many Americans, including Thomas Jefferson, wanted the United States to favor France. After all, the French had helped the Americans win independence. But Washington worked to keep the young nation out of the conflict. This photo here has a man saying Federalists are better than Republicans, and this man saying no, they're not. By the time Washington's second term ended, he was no longer a popular hero. The reason? Politics. In the 1790s, political parties had just begun to develop. Two parties, each led by a member of Washington's original cabinet, constantly criticized each other. So there weren't any parties at this point. There was no Democrats and Republicans, but two people in Washington's government, we call it the cabinet, had kind of started two parties. Let's keep going. Thomas Jefferson led the Republicans, that's one party, and Alexander Hamilton led the Federalists, the other party at the time. Because he usually sided with the Federalists, Washington was the target of ugly attacks by Republicans. So now there's two groups of people, and when Washington agrees with one or the other group of people get angry. And it sounds like he tended to agree with the Federalists over the Republicans. In this photo, after 8 years as president, Washington stepped down. One of his last acts as president was to give the nation some advice. His farewell address, published in newspapers across the country, warned Americans to avoid political parties. He believed they would destroy the unity of the new nation. So the unity is like the bond of togetherness. He was afraid political parties would destroy the bond between everyone in the country. He also warned against getting involved in Europe's affairs. Remember, he didn't go and help France when they were fighting when they were fighting England. He warned against getting involved in Europe's affairs, Europe's issues. He felt America should put all its energy into building its own government. America was so young, he advised to invest time and energy into ourselves. And here's Washington's first cabinet, so the people in government. During his first term, Washington chose talented people to help him lead the nation. Under the new Constitution, Congress created the Departments of War, State, and Treasury. The heads of these departments and the Attorney General made up Washington's cabinet, so a group of advisors in the government. The Constitution does not mention a cabinet, but Washington often called his department heads together to advise him, to give him advice. The presidents who followed have done the same. So here is Henry Cox, a trusted general during the Revolution. He headed the Department of War. Here's Thomas Jefferson. He headed the Department of State. It was in charge of overseeing relations between the United States and other countries. Alexander Hamilton ran the Treasury Department, handling the government's finances. And then Edmund Randolph was named the first Attorney General of the United States. He was in charge of giving the government advice on legal matters. So Washington was smart enough to know that he didn't know everything. So he made a cabinet of people he could trust and ask advice on how to bring the states together and to form and continue the government. Now our last 2 pages, Mount Vernon. We've talked about this a few times in this magazine. Remember, Mount Vernon is where his older brother lived. When George was a young boy, he went to live with his older brother Lawrence here and came back here after being president for 8 years. So let's read about it. Top of page 16. Mount Vernon. When George Washington stepped down as president, he returned to Mount Vernon. Although the estate had been his home for 45 years, he had spent many years away from it. He and Martha were glad to be back. "The General and I," wrote Martha to a friend, "feel like children just released from school." Washington enjoyed farming. He worked hard to get Mount Vernon running smoothly. By the end of his life, he had divided his 8,000 acres of land into 5 farms. Each farm had its own overseers, supervisors, or people in charge, a workforce of enslaved people, livestock, tools, and buildings. After checking on his farms one snowy December morning in 1799, Washington came down with a cold. He soon had a high fever. On December 14th, at age 67, he died. Congress had a special vault built for him under the U.S. Capitol in Washington, D.C. But the vault remains empty to this day. The nation's first president wanted to be buried at Mount Vernon, and so he was. Having worked long and faithfully for his country, George Washington at last rested as a private citizen. So here's a map of the property. It's massive. It's a bunch of buildings. These look like gardens. I think there's more farms farther out. And so number 1 is a greenhouse. In the greenhouse, Washington liked to grow and experiment with unusual plants and trees. As enslaved person, an enslaved person was in charge of tending the fire that kept the greenhouse warm. He lived in the stoveroom. Excuse me. Number 2 were the slave quarters. Enslaved people at Mount Vernon slept, cooked, and ate in single-room wooden houses. To add to their food allowance, they planted gardens and raised chickens. They also fished and hunted. The shoemaker's shop. The shoemaker made boots as well as shoes. He also repaired various types of leather goods, such as harnesses and saddles for horses. The botanical garden. In this garden, Washington experimented with plantings. In the beginning, tobacco was his main crop, but the soil proved wrong for that crop, and tobacco prices fell, so he switched to growing wheat. Number 5 is the salt house. The salt house stored salt for preserving and curing fish and meat. It also stored large barrels of salted fish. These were mostly shad and herring that had been caught in the Potomac River. So remember, there's no freezers. So in order to keep their meat from spoiling, they salted it. Spinning room is number 6. Here, 10 or more enslaved persons sat at spinning wheels. They turned wool and flax into thread. Then weavers wove the thread into cloth for clothing or other goods. So they had to take wool and flax, which is, when you imagine wool, it's what is on a sheep, right? You shave the sheep, and they spin it into threads, strings, that are then woven into clothing. Number 7 is the mansion. Washington inherited an 8-room farmhouse from Lawrence, his older brother. He rebuilt it into a 21-room mansion. Martha and George welcomed all guests. They enjoyed entertaining, whether they were having teas, barbecues, clam bakes, or formal dinners. Number 8 is the kitchen. Here, enslaved people prepared daily meals. Martha told them what to cook. George's favorite breakfast was 3 cornmeal cakes, swimming in honey and butter. He washed these down with 3 cups of tea without cream. One of his favorite dishes was crab meat soup. He also loved sweet potatoes with coconut, ham with oyster sauce, and string beans with mushrooms. 9 is the storehouse. The storehouse held clothing for enslaved people. It also held tools, nails, and goods that Washington had purchased in Britain and the US. 10 is the smokehouse. The smokehouse held hams, bacon, and pork sides as they aged. The meat was salted, smoked, or dried to preserve it. remember, so it didn't spoil and go rotten. 11 was the wash house. The enslaved persons stationed here had a heavy workload. 6 days a week, they washed, dried, and ironed the Washington family's clothes. They also did this for guests who visited. 12 is the laundry yard. This area was used for drying clothes and linens in the sun. And then 13, the burial ground. Mount Vernon's enslaved people were buried here in unmarked graves. So we had a whole team of slaves working at Mount Vernon to make it run smoothly. We're going to learn about that right here, bottom of page 16. The success of Mount Vernon depended on the hard work of enslaved Africans. By the time he died, Washington held more than 300 people in slavery. They worked as housekeepers, weavers, carpenters, makers, cobblers, nurses, handymen, cooks, and field hands. Washington took young enslaved man, William Lee, to war with him. Lee was at Valley Forge and the siege of Yorktown. After the war was over, many enslaved people found freedom under the Virginia Legislators' Law of 1783. It freed those who had helped America win independence. Unlike most other Southern planters of his time, Washington grew to believe that slavery was wrong. His will called for the people he held in slavery to be freed. So a will is what you want to do with your, I guess, stuff after you die. So people have wills today. And so in his will, after he died, it said his slaves could be free. Then at Mount Vernon, Washington always tried to keep to the same routine. He got up at dawn, shaved, and had his long hair combed and tied back with a ribbon. After breakfast at 7 a.m., he rode off on horseback to inspect his farms. He returned to change for dinner, which was served at 3 p.m. Tea was served at 6 p.m., followed by a light supper. Washington liked to go to bed early at around 9 p.m. unless visitors came. And here is a telescope used by Washington, which is still at Mount Vernon, I would guess. So that's the end of our magazine. We learn about the property where he spent a lot of time, especially at the end of his life. A little bit about him and his role as president. His career as a general in the American Revolution. About America in general during his lifetime. His early military career in the French and Indian War. His early life growing up. Some general information about him. So, my friends, go ahead and complete your choice board, and I'll see you next week.